Eliza and Ren, what thoughtful divrei Torah you've offered us this morning on a very difficult and gory parasha. Out of an archaic practice that most of us find repugnant, you both managed to discern meaningful lessons that speak to us today. Now, Ren, you grappled with the question of a sacrifice as a way of reaching towards something higher. The idea that we are animals, and yet there's something about us that's more sublime. And the word korban, which we translate as sacrifice, which really means to draw near to that more elevated aspect of our being. And Eliza, you grappled with the requirement that the sacrifices be healthy and unblemished or perfect. And what you learned was that this represented the idea of dedication and effort, of giving your best or trying your hardest, and even being willing to do something unpleasant for a greater good. And I want to pull these ideas together. The idea of sacrifice as a way of reaching towards something higher, the idea of dedication and effort, of giving your best and trying your hardest, and even being willing to do something unpleasant for a greater good. The very first word of our parasha, the word that became the name of this entire book of Torah, is Vayikra, and it means God called. The thing that's interesting about this word is that the last letter is an aleph, which is a silent letter. And in the Torah, in this word, that aleph is written unusually small. Every Torah scroll in the world has a small aleph in this one word. And it's the only place in the Torah where that's the case. Why? Now, let's remember what's going on here in the bigger picture. Let's go back to the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story, and what I'm about to say was influenced by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, also influenced Ren. At the beginning of the story, God creates the world and creates human beings, Adam and Eve, to be God's partners. But then humanity screws up. They become murderous and corrupt. And by the time Noah comes along, humanity is so depraved, so completely full of violence and corruption that God gives up on them and destroys our world. God's next strategy is to start with one family, Abraham and Sarah, and to see if maybe this one family could be molded to be ethical. And part of the plan is to make this people be enslaved so that they will learn how terrible it is when human beings harm each other. And they will emerge from that experience committed to doing right in the world. That was the plan. That leads us to the Exodus story, and then when our people are freed from centuries of bondage, we're led to Mount Sinai, where we get the principles of how to live with one another in fairness and in peace. That's the Torah. And now, by then, we're no longer a single family, but we're an entire nation, which includes an Erev Rav, a big mixed multitude of people who were enslaved with us and came out, were freed with us, and are now trying to live by this new way of life. But God knows that we're going to forget these principles, these mitzvot, this path of a good life, as different challenges come our way. So God instructs us to build a mishkan, a tabernacle, a meeting place where God can dwell in our midst so that we can draw near to God on a regular basis, to remember again and again and again that our purpose is to dedicate our lives to doing right and to doing good. That brings us to now. And as you taught us, Eliza and Ren, the reason that animal sacrifice was the thing that we did at the Mishkan was because that was what we knew. It was what all the other people around us were doing. And so the idea, as the Rambam or Maimonides teaches, was to wean us off of the idolatrous practices of the world that we were in, one step at a time. The first big change was that rather than have a sacrifice to an idol, like a golden calf, as others were doing, with the idea that there were many competing and warring gods, we would sacrifice to a single, invisible, intangible, unifying God. Even if we used the same practices, animal sacrifice, it was to a different God. And so, at the end of the last parsha, after a long building process that everyone participated in, the tabernacle, the Mishkan, is complete, and immediately God's presence fills it. Fills it entirely, so much so that Moses is standing outside. That's how the last parsha ends. Maybe Moses is in awe or fear, but we don't know why, but he's outside the tabernacle. God's presence has filled the tabernacle, and the book of Exodus ends. And now our parsha and the new book begins, and we've got Moses outside, we've got God inside calling. The first word is, and he called. Say, They called, she called, God called. And Rabbi Art Green says, all the Torah's narrative has been leading up to this point, the moment of the call to serve. So too are our own narratives. All of our life stories lead up to this moment, and they're there to prepare us for that call. And now the question of the small aleph. The rabbis point out that when God tells us to build the tabernacle, the Mishkan, God says, build me a Mishkan so that I will dwell within them. Not within it, but within them, within the people, within all of the people. And Hasidic master Meor Einaim says, that is why Vayikra is written with a miniature aleph. God is present in miniature form within each Israelite, I'd say each person, calling us to return. Meor Einaim says, these are our pangs of conscience, but we do not perceive them as God's own call to us, end quote. Because it's coming from within. And the aleph is a silent letter. It's telling us to listen. In the last few weeks, I have been witness to something extraordinary. In the context of a terrible, tragic conflict that included extreme atrocities against our people by the terrorist organization Hamas, and a response by Prime Minister Netanyahu's government that has killed tens of thousands of Palestinian people and has 2 million more homeless and starving on the edge of famine, with still more than 130 of our people held hostage in tunnels or other unknown locations. In the midst of that, our member of our congregation, Senator Chuck Schumer, heard that call. He heard a call from within him. And even though he is a highly political man with a ton of political pressure on him, this was something different than that. He put the calculations of risk aside. He felt compelled. His conscience was calling to him. I saw it. I heard it. It was real. And he did something courageous with the goal of bringing us closer to peace. But that call, it's not just to Moses and it's not just to Senator Schumer. This is our people's story of how we've been called. And every person on the earth has been called in its own way. And everyone among us, every single person, is called in our own way. That's the point. The small aleph of Vayikra is in every one of us. We are all being continually called with a still small voice from within. And we can hear it if we listen. Tonight and tomorrow is the holiday of Purim. And this holiday is an invitation to joy, even in the midst of fear, even in the midst of vulnerability, even in the midst of war. In this story, the hero is Esther, and when the Jewish people face the threat of annihilation by an enemy who seeks to eliminate us, Esther's conscience within her is awakened, and she decides that she will speak up at great risk to herself. And her words and actions save the Jewish people. Now, two things about this. First, Esther's name can be read as Astir, I will hide, which refers to the idea that God has hidden God's face, and that is why bad things are happening to the Jewish people. God appears nowhere in the Megillah. Not even God's name is mentioned. Esther's courage shows that even when we cannot find God in the world, we human beings have the power to do the right thing and even change the course of history by listening within. And even though God is invisible in the story, you can see God in Esther. In Esther's finding herself in the right place and at the right time to do something that matters. And you can see God in Esther's awakening of conscience and her ability to listen to find the right thing to do. And second, that's not the whole story. Because at the end of the story, in chapter 9, as they act to defend themselves, the Jewish people of the Persian Empire killed tens of thousands of others. And even though it was just one family or a specific group that tried to kill us, our violence was turned broader than that, against tens of thousands of people. And by the way, the Haftarah that we didn't read today is similar, in which we're supposed to kill a lot of people, whether or not they were violent against us. That's why we didn't read it. So the Megillah includes a revenge fantasy. But we know that the Megillah story, it never happened. It was a fantasy that was a distant imagination. It was something kind of almost ridiculous for our ancestors to imagine, because we were never in a position to do that. But now our people have power. We have an army. We can actually use our power to harm. And so this year I'm asking us tonight, when we hear the Megillah, to do something different. And during the Megillah reading tonight, that will be right here, I'm going to make a request of all the people gathered, all the people who will fill this sanctuary for revelry. And let me be clear, revelry and joy, very good for us right now. Very welcome. But I'm going to ask the party-goers to consider silencing their groggers and hushing their voices when we come to chapter 9, the chapter that includes our violence. And I'm going to suggest that we should sit in somber silence for that chapter to reflect on our impulse to revenge, to reflect on the grave responsibility that comes with holding power, and to reflect on the moral imperative to honor human life when we are defending ourselves. Most of us are not the Senate Majority Leader. Most of us are not the Queen of the Persian Empire. But wherever we stand, wherever we work, wherever we live, whatever school we go to, whatever friendship network we're in, whatever social media universe we find ourselves in, we have some measure of power, some measure of influence. We have a voice, every one of us. Animal creatures, yet more than animals, able to elevate ourselves to something more sublime, able to give our best, able to try our hardest, able to do even unpleasant, difficult, risky things in service of a greater good, able to draw near to the small, silent letter within us, calling us to our best purpose. Shabbat shalom.